Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today I'm going to be talking about the Fatimid Caliphate or Khilafah al-Fatimiyya. I'm really grateful to be here. Before I get started with the presentation, I have a quick question for you guys. Why do we study history? It's fun, right? I mean, learning stories about people who lived before us is really fun. And we have really fun stories in history, and we know better about places and nations and stuff like that. But why do we have any other reasons to study history? I would like to pull up an ayah from Quran, a verse from Quran, which says, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to the believers, and He's giving us a direct order. And the order is to walk on earth and look into the fate of the people who preceded us. So it's a direct order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's part of our religion, it's part of our deen to study history and to learn about previous nations. Regardless, Muslim nations, non-Muslim nations, believers, non-believers will always have something to learn. And making our community and our ummah stronger is not an option. It's mandated on us. So any tool that will help us do that, we should use it. And history is definitely one of the most important tools. So let's start with the Fatimid Caliphate. Who are the Fatimid? Those are a group of Ismaili Shia Muslims. They named themselves after the Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam radiallahu anha. We'll learn a little bit about it as we proceed. When did this caliphate start? I mean, which part of history did this caliphate existed? It existed for more than 2 centuries, between the years 909 and 1171. So this caliphate ended almost 900 years ago. So where was this caliphate? Where was this state? It existed mainly in northern Africa: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. Also, it involved Sicily in the Mediterranean, which is now part of Italy. Part of Levant and Hijaz as well were involved with the rule by the Fatimids. The main capital for the Fatimid Caliphate was in Cairo, Egypt. And this map is gonna join us for a while. It shows us the maximum extent of the Fatimid Caliphate. So if you look into this, this is Africa. Most of this map involves Africa and part of Asia. This is what we call the Middle East. So as you see, all the green part of the map is where the Fatimid state existed. You see most of North Africa, or nearly all states in North Africa, Morocco from the far west all the way to Egypt on the far right, involving Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya in between, and part of Sudan as well, southern Egypt. And if we look into Asia, the Asian part, we'll find like most of Levante, like Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Iraq, as well as Hijaz, Medina, Mecca, and parts of Yemen as well. It was a huge state when it reached its maximum power. This is a quick timeline of Islamic history, starting from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who died in the year 632, followed immediately by the Rashid Caliphate, which lasted for nearly 30 years, ended by the year 661 when Ali radiallahu anhu was killed. And then the Umayyad dynasty started from 661 to 750, and then they lasted almost like 110 years, almost like 9 years. And then the Abbasid dynasty started, was the longest amongst the Islamic history, from 750 to 1258. We learned this in the last lecture. And then the Mongols attacked, ended the Abbasid dynasty, and then other states started, the Mamluk and the Ottoman. Of course, the Abbasid remained extended for a while. The Mamluks inaugurated the Abbasid dynasty when they managed to start their state, but the Abbasid dynasty technically ended in this time, 1258. So where does the Fatimid state lie? It lied in this part of Islamic history. So it started 909 up until 1171. So it's 2.5 centuries almost, 260 years, something like this. And it's central. If you look into the Islamic history, it's like in the center of the Islamic history. So that's why it's pretty important for us to learn. And as we proceed, we'll know more reasons why we need to study the Fatimid Caliphate. So we started saying that it's basically the Ismaili Shias who were the people who established this state. So who are the Shias? It's very important for us to know this. The word Shia means partisans or supporters of anything. In our history, the Shias are the supporters of Ali radiallahu anhu, the cousin of the Prophet and the husband of Fatima al-Zahra radiallahu anha, and the fourth Khalifa in the history of Islam. So in the case of Shias, what makes them peculiar? They consider themselves the partisans of Ali ibn Abi Talib, as we said, but they consider the descendants of Ali. and Fatima to be the rightful rulers of the Islamic State and called them imams. Actually, they started this notion from immediately after the death of the Prophet, as we'll see later in later slides. This flowchart is pretty helpful to make us understand what does Shia mean and what does Sunni mean. So the Sunnis, which is the majority of the Islamic world, I believe most of us are, they approved the ruling of Abu Bakr following the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we consider Abu Bakr as the first Khalifat Rasulullah. The word Khalifa means the successor. And then following Abu Bakr, there was Umar radiallahu anhu, who ruled almost for 10 years. And then after Umar, we have Uthman radiallahu anhu, the third Khalifa who ruled for almost 11 years. And then afterwards came Ali, the fourth Khalifa, and he ruled for almost 5 years, sorry. And then the fifth Khalifa will be Al-Hasan, the son of Ali, radiallahu anhu. And then the path is separate here. The sixth Khalifa for Sunnis is Muawiyah, radiallahu anhu, who established the Umayyad dynasty or the Umayyad Caliphate. But then at this point, the Shia's separation from the Sunnis becomes very well prominent. They did not approve Muawiyah as the Caliphate. They believed that Al-Hussein was more worthy and he should be followed. And as we'll see, the descendants of Al-Hussein constitute the other imams for the Shias. So what happened after the death of the Prophet? The Shias believed, some of the Sahaba, some of the scholars who studied history believed that Ali was the more worthy to follow the Prophet, to be the successor of the Prophet. Those are minority. Most of the Muslims believed that Abu Bakr was the person who deserved to the successor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was the person that the Prophet ordered to become the imam of the Muslims' prayers when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was too sick to do so. But Ali radiallahu anhu was living, and he did not rebel. He accepted the ruling of Abu Bakr, he accepted the ruling of Umar, and he accepted the ruling of Uthman radiallahu anhum. So the Shias who claimed to be supporters of Ali, to be the successor of the Prophet, had no good reason to believe that they did need to do anything. The true rise of the movement of Shias happened after Ali radiallahu anhu was killed by the Kharijites. Al-Khawarij, or the Kharijites, are the people who were responsible about killing Ali radiallahu anhu. And then after the death of Ali radiallahu anhu, we know that Al-Hasan was appointed by most of the Muslims, and then Al-Hasan became the fifth, according to most of the Islamic scholars, most of the Islamic historians, became the fifth Rashid Caliphate, and this was in the year 661 in January. However, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, who was the ruler of Al-Sham, Damascus, from Umar ibn Khattab, during Umar ibn Khattab ruling and during Uthman's ruling, he protested and he did not accept this because he simply was the next of kin for Uthman radiallahu anhu, who was killed, and he believed that he was the one worthy to pursue the revenge for Uthman's. Ali radiallahu anhu was trying to pursue this revenge as well, but he had different priorities given that he was the caliphate back then. And of course, the Ahdath al-Fitna, when the Ali and Muawiyah, they did not go in accord and there were some sort of fights. I'm not going to elaborate on those. But then after Ali radiallahu anhu was killed, not by Muawiyah, not by anyone, by the Kharijit, a third group, there was a pause. Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu was given al-bay'ah, was given the allegiance from most of the Muslims except Muawiyah, and there was a fight that was about to start between Muawiyah and Al-Hasan radiallahu anhuma. But then Al-Hasan decided to retire from his position and to sign a treaty with Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. And this was after 8 months from the death of Ali radiallahu anhu, or the 8 months from the start of era of Al-Hasan. So this was in August 661. And this treaty, this agreement, specified the situation for nearly 20 years. Actually, the Prophet ﷺ has prophesied this in one of his ahadith. He was looking at Al-Hasan when he was his grandson, when he was just a little kid, and he was speaking to the Sahaba and told them, إِنَّ ابْنِي هَذَا سَيِّدًا وَلَعَلَّ اللَّهُ أَنْ يُصْلِحَ بِهِ بَيْنَ طَائِفَتَيْنِ كَبِيرَتَيْنِ مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. My grandson, this is a noble man. He was just a little kid, but the Prophet was giving them a prophecy about his future. My grandson is a noble man, and I wish that Allah will make him the reason to bring peace between two big Muslim groups. And this actually what happened almost 30 years later. The Prophet died in the year 632, and this happened at 61. So 29 years later, Al-Hasan radiallahu anh signed this treaty, and this was the reason to save the Muslims from bloodshed. Al-Hasan died after he signed the treaty. He moved together with his brother Al-Hussein, and he moved back to Medina from Kufa, where they were residing, and they stayed there politically uninvolved. As long as Muawiyah is keeping the terms of the treaty, they were happy. They didn't do anything. And then after the death of Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein was according to the Shias, was the worthy imam following him, but Al-Hussein was following the treaty, so he did not do anything. He did not ask, he did not request to become a Khalifa or something like this, and he honored the treaty that was signed between Muawiyah and Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu. However, towards the end of Muawiyah's life, he tried to appoint his son Yazid as his successor, and this was at the year of 680, and this is the year where Muawiyah died. And then Al-Hussein, at this point of time, he decided not to agree with that, and he thought that there should be a different way for Muslims to pick their Khalifa. And actually, there were some callings for Al-Hussein to take over and become the Khalifa after Muawiyah actually died, and Yazid was given al-Bay'ah in Sham or Syria, where his father and their capital were in al-Sham, Damascus. Actually, people in Iraq did not give the al-Bay'ah right away, and they called on Al-Hussein to take over and come back to Kufa, which was the capital for the Caliphate of Ali radiallahu anhu, and they promised him to support him against Muawiyah. Al-Hussein took his kins, his people, and he moved to Al-Kufa to meet his supporters, but midway he was intercepted by Yazid's army, and the Battle of Karbala happened, unfortunately, and Al-Hussein was martyred. And this was at the year 680 when he was 54 years of age. Of course, the Shias, this is a very important history for us as Sunni and Shias, and up until now there is no disagreement between Sunnis and Shias. We think that Al-Hasan was worthy, but he signed a treaty. We think that Al-Hussein was worthy as well, and his movement might have a good reason for that. And of course, killing Al-Hussein is disapproved by each and every member of the Sunni Muslims, including Yazid himself. He did not approve killing Al-Hussein. But this is a long story, and we don't want to dive into it. What matters to us is that this flowchart helps us understand what happened. So the Shias, they believe that Ali was the more worthy of being the successor of the Prophet ﷺ, and then Al-Hussein should have been Al-Hasan, would be the second imam. The third imam should be Al-Hussein, who was martyred, and then they started having their own imams afterwards, the successors of Al-Hussein, the bloodline coming from Al-Hussein. Ali Zayn al-Abidin, Muhammad al-Baqir, Ja'far al-Sadiq, Musa al-Kadhim, Ali al-Rida, Muhammad al-Jawad, Ali al-Hadi, Hassan al-Askari, and Muhammad al-Muntazir. So those are 12, starting from Ali, Hassan, Al-Hussein. Those are 12. They are very important imams for Shias, but we're not going to discuss more than that. What happened when the Umayyad dynasty, followed by the Abbasid dynasty, came in charge, the Shias movement, or the supporters of the Shia principles, tried to do everything they can to instate their state and to appoint their imams as leaders for the Muslim state. But of course, the Umayyads and the Abbasid Caliphate were very strong. They have a very well organized ruling and very well organized states, and they managed to prevent them from doing so by oppression, simply incarcerating each and everyone who supports them. They tried to make sure that ruling went with that smoothly without any interruptions from the Shias. Keep in mind that the Umayyads and the Abbasids made claim for the right to become the caliphs simply because they belonged to the bloodline close to the Prophet ﷺ. The Umayyads were from the same tribe, from Quraysh, and the Abbasids belonged to Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, which was the uncle of the Prophet. Now the Shias are coming and telling they actually have a closer link to the Prophet. They're supporting imams who are the descendants of Fatima radiallahu anha and Ali radiallahu anha. How could they beat that? So it was a tough call for them, and their only way to manage this is through oppression. So 2 centuries passed, and during those 2 centuries, the Shias tried hard to achieve their goal and make a state for their imams and put their imams in ruling. They tried hard in each and every place in the Islamic state. In Yemen, they tried in Baghdad, they tried in Egypt, tried each and everywhere. But the power of the Abbasid Caliphate was so strong, they couldn't do anything actually. They couldn't achieve anything. Up until in the late 10th, in the beginning of the 10th century, they managed to start something, a small state in Northern Africa, in the western part of North Africa. So they had a movement called Da'i movement, like a person who would support, would ask, who would call for help, call for tribes, meet people from everywhere in the Islamic world and try to bring them to support their cause. And And in the year 893, one of their da'is managed to bring the Kutama tribe, one of the big tribes in northern Africa, to support their cause. And he started fighting the Aghalibs, Al-Aghaliba, which is a state that was instated in northern Africa, in Algeria and Tunisia. And they, with the support of the Kutama tribe, they started a fight that lasted for 5 years. And then after 5 years of continuous fighting, in the year 909, they managed to establish a very well-formed state in northern Africa. It was smallest in the beginning, but as we'll see later on, they started their expansion process. As I said, this was not the first try for Shias. They tried for almost more than 2 centuries to reach this point. And now in this time, they managed to establish their first goal, which is establishing a state, though small. This part is here in Tunisia, and this area was where the Kutama tribe resided, and this was the Aghalibs state. And you see those arrows shows us like the repeated fights and movement trying to rule the Aghalibs, and actually they managed to do this in the year 909. And now when this happened, the da'is, or the guys who started the support and collecting people to support the cause, they started to looking for their imam. You remember, they believed that the guy who should rule is simply the imam. He should be a descendant from the prophet's lineage, from Fatima. At that time, their imam was the guy they called for is Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah. So we don't know exactly where he were. He was hiding somewhere in the east, probably in Syria, under the noses of the Abbasid, but he made a very good plan, so they couldn't know where he is. And we don't know exactly his relationship to the Prophet ﷺ. It was not very clear. So good in hiding, the Shias, when they're doing their movement on those 2 centuries, because otherwise they would have been taken care of by the Umayyad and the Abbasids. So they did very good job in their hiding and doing their secret movement, to the point that they had a state already established in Tunisia or in northern Africa, and then they called for their imam to come, and he came in a very mysterious way. We don't know exactly how he managed to travel from Syria all the way to Tunisia, across Egypt and Libya, but he managed to come, and he was inaugurated as the imam, the first caliphate of the Fatimid dynasty in the year 909. He died in the 934, so he remained in power for 25 years. So his first capital was Ruqada. Ruqada was actually the capital of the Aghalibs state, so they simply took over the city, and they started their first ruling from this city. It was their first capital, and they actually minted their coin, which was like the golden dinar that has the name of the first imam on. And after some time, in the year 921, they managed to build their own caliphate, their own capital, which was Medina al-Mahdiyah, the city of al-Mahdiyah. And then they started expansion. They started the expansion process. They went to the west. So they expanded more towards Morocco, towards northern Africa, more to the west. And the reason for that is that they didn't want to go east and face the Abbasid and the Abbasid Caliphate, where its associates in Egypt and Syria, though they tried, but their trials were always failing. So they figured out that it's better for them to expand to the west. And that's what they started doing. The second and third caliphs who followed Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah who were responsible for that expansion. We're not going to mention them. We don't want to overload you with information, but it was the fourth caliph that actually made a difference. His name was Al-Mu'izz li-Dinillah, a very famous name. And the reason for that is that this is a very strong person. We know that the theme in history, that hard time makes strong people and good times make weak people. This time of expansion, those first 3 decades in the history of the Fatimid state, was very tough. Those decades were hard. They tried to expand in the west, and they faced a lot of opposition from the Umayyad, who were living in Al-Andalus, and it was very hard for them to expand and to have a stable ruling in this area. They had a lot of uprising, a lot of riots, a lot of opposition. So it was tough, and it took them almost 30 years for a strong man to come. Actually, 2 strong men. I'm going to talk about the second one soon. So the first strong man, the fourth caliphate, he was Al-Mu'izz li-Dinillah, who started ruling in the year 953, and he died in the year 975. He made some strategic changes. He was a very good person in terms of like planning and managing and being able to collect the good people, like the strong people around him. And he was never hasty. He took his time. So he tried to make very good preparation before each and every step he was doing. And actually, he was lucky to have a strong general with him. This general was Jawhar ibn Abdullah, or also known as Jawhar al-Saqili. He was from Sicily, Italy. And this general was the main army leader, and he was a very strong, very able person in terms of achieving their goals. And he was a very good follower and an obedient follower for the caliphate. He was a good believer in the cause of the Fatimids. So this guy managed to actually stabilize the situation in Northern Africa, and he prepared very slowly. It took him 14 years to start his movement towards Egypt. So he prepared everything. By the time they started moving to Egypt, their armies were in hundreds of thousands. They have huge armies, and their success was a matter of time. And actually, they were lucky back then because Egypt was ruled back then by the Ikhshidis, which were simply one of the smaller states that were ruling under the supervision of the Abbasid. And in 1969, the last Ikhshidi ruler died. His name was Kafur al-Ikhshidi. He died back then, and Egypt went into chaos. There was no actual good management of the state. People were in poverty. There was a lot of riots, no safety or stability. So actually, lots of people in Egypt, like the wealthy people, the people in power, the statesmen there, they reached out to the Fatimid and asked them to come over and start ruling Egypt, because simply they saw how good they were, Mu'izz ad-Din al-Fatimi and Jawhar al-Saqili, in managing Northern Africa, the parts that were under the ruling. So, of course, this was a dream for the Fatimids, so they started moving towards Egypt. They had a good tactic, and their tactic was to provide the Egyptian people with a lot of promises that they would not change their religion from Sunnis to Shia. So by then, of course, you know that Egypt was part of the Sunni world, and there were a lot of worries among the Egyptians and among Egyptian statesmen that if the Fatimid come, they might change the religion in Egypt into the Shia. Was something that did not make them happy and very open to get the Fatimid on board. But actually, the Mu'izz ad-Din al-Fatimi was very smart. He assured the Egyptians that he would not change their religion. And of course, when the Egyptians heard so, given their bad situation, they were okay with having the Fatimids as their new rulers. And actually, it did not take them a long time for Jawhar al-Saqili to come and conquer the Ikhshidis and actually to be in charge to rule Egypt. So what was the first thing that Jawhar did? First of all, he moved by himself. He didn't take the Khalifa with him. You know, the Imam is very precious for the Shias. So they kept him in safety. They kept him in Al-Mahdiya, their main capital. They didn't bring him over to Egypt right away. And Jawhar, he went, he's the strong man with his troops. The historian said the army was anywhere between 100 and 200,000, and he actually didn't face any fighting. People in Egypt were very receptive. They were very happy having this strong man to take over and fix the bad things that were running there back then, simply because the Ikhshidis were so weak. So what was the first thing that Jawhar did? The first thing that he did was building a new capital. And this capital was initially called Al-Mansuriya, referring to the father of Mu'izz ad-Din al-Fatimi. This is the third caliph, Al-Mansur. And after 4 years, they decided to change the name into Al-Qahira, or Cairo in English. And Al-Qahira means the conqueror, the vanquisher. So they were hoping that this city, the new city, will be the reason to conquer the Abbasid. That's why it was called this name. So the first thing was building a new city. And this city was, we're going to talk about Al-Qahira later on, was where the caliphate were supposed to live and the army. What was the second thing for him to do is building a new mosque within the city, Al-Azhar Mosque. By naming the mosque Al-Azhar, they were simply referring to Fatima al-Zahra. You see, everything is like they're trying to send messages here. So Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet radiallahu anha, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, they referred to her by naming the mosque after her name, Al-Azhar. And this was in the year 970. So 3 years later, the caliphate, after everything was stable and establishing his city and everything was, and building a palace inside the city, the caliphate moved from Al-Mahdiya all the way to Cairo, to Al-Qahira. And it was a very nice trip. The caliphate caravan was moving on land, and the ships, the fleet of the Fatimid state was simply following through the Mediterranean to provide protection. So it was like a very huge caravan going all the way from Al-Mahdiya to the new capital in Cairo. He stabilized his ruling in a very good way. His strategies were fine. He dealt with the Egyptians in a very mild manner. He was very generous. He was very just with them. They were very happy. He helped them. He built dams. He built canals on the Nile. He helped the farmers, the agriculture system. They did a whole lot of good things to establish their ruling. And actually, in the initial phase of their ruling, they tried to keep their promise, where they did not try to change the religions of the Egyptians. But actually, the Azhar mosque, building the Azhar mosque, was the very first sign that they were not keeping their promise. Because the Azhar mosque, when they built it, it was built in 2 years. It was opened in 1972. They started teaching the Shia principles inside the mosque. After everything was stable, they started started expanding to the east, and they reached their plateau when following Caliph, the son of Al-Mu'izzuddin Al-Aziz Billah, where the Fatimid state reached its maximum strength. As you can see here, it's the ruling of the Fatimid Caliphate back then was even more than that actually what the Abbasid had under their hands. And then following this is the plateau of our Caliphate, the Fatimid dynasty, and as we know, there's a rise and there's a fall, and in between them there's a plateau. So we can say that the plateau was the time of Al-Aziz and the initial time of Al-Mustansir. So Al-Mustansir was the Caliph that followed Al-Aziz. The importance of Al-Mustansir is for two reasons: that he ruled for almost 60 years, 58 years exactly, from 1036 up until 1094. So he started his ruling when he was like 5-year-old, and he stayed in charge till he died, and this was after 58 years. So he ruled for a very long time. And of course, a Caliph starting at the age of 5, it's not something that you expect him to do a good job. And actually, this is what happened. He started doing a fatal mistake. This fatal mistake was not his own mistake. It was the mistake that was done by the previous Caliphs as well. You know, the Caliphates, they were very concerned and were very worried about keeping their power. And so they tried to do something that none of the other Caliphs did before. So they kept their entourage and their close people from non-Islamic religions. So they had a lot of advisors, Christian advisors, Jewish advisors. By doing so, they were trying to make sure that they were feeling safe that those advisors would never be accepted by the people as rulers. So there was no way for them to rebel on them and take over the power. So they simply did this plan, which initially sounds like reasonable. What it means is that most of their advisors were non-Muslims, and the people that they're ruling, the majority of their people are Muslims, Sunnis, and maybe some Shias. So how come you have all the power, all the statesmen to be people who do not share the most important thing with their people, which is their religion? So this was one of the fatal mistakes that they did. The other mistake was that giving charge to a 5-year-old kid, Al-Mustansir, when his father died, they simply delivered the ruling to him, and he was simply a kid. And of course, other people around him were taking charge and they were making use of him. And this did not help the performance of the state. So in addition to the Christians and Jews, they also introduced different people from Turks. They called upon Turks to get their support. They called upon Sudanese. They formed troops to help stabilize the ruling. And you know what? When things become really good, prosperous, there's a lot of money, a lot of supplies in the state. Those troops started to struggle together and looking for power. Berbers, the remaining of Katama tribe residing in Upper Egypt, also started rioting. And to top it off, in the year 1062, the Nile dried up and a very bad time started, which was the Mustansir famine. It lasted for 5 years. This famine was the worst in the history of Egypt. Egypt has a very long history, thousands of years, but never heard of something like this. Al-Mustansir famine, this was between 1062 and 1067. And in this Al-Mustansir famine, poverty was everywhere. People didn't have any resources. The Nile dried up. There was no alternatives. There was no food. There's nothing to cultivate. People was hungry to the point that if you read in history, people started eating each other. Like humans eating human beings simply because they couldn't find anything to eat. And one of the stories I heard that the Caliphate had, in a regular day, he had 300 horses under his disposal in his stable. During this famine, he had simply 3 horses. During one of his motorcades, his escort simply collapsed beside him because he was hungry. Imagine the escort of the Caliphate collapsing from hunger. So during this time, the decline time, the control of the Fatimid over Syria and the Palestine started to decline. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, started attacking and taking advantage of this and actually taking lands from them. So Al-Mustansir came up with an idea. He decided to call on a strong man, strong men help. So he called for one of his governors, the governor of the city of Acre, Akka, in northern Palestine. This part of Palestine shoreline has Akka in. Acre is a very known old city, and it was ruled by a very strong man called Badr al-Jamali. So he called on him to come over to help him out in Egypt. So he arrived to Egypt in 1072, and actually he was a very good person in terms of managing things and managing the state in a proper way, and he managed to end actually the Mustansir famine, and he managed to stabilize things. But now, and lots of historians consider this guy is the reason for the revival of the Fatimid Caliphate and giving it a reason to stay in power for another 100 years. But now the second stage of the Fatimid era was a stage when the ministers like Badr al-Jamali and his successors became stronger, way stronger than the caliphates. The caliphates became like puppies, simply a puppet that's put in the palace to take their names as a reason to rule, but actually the power was within the hands of the ministers, the wazara. And then we have 100 years of fights between the ministers. There was no actual, with weak rulers, all sorts of uprise and disruption starts to happen. We have a very long history of multiple ministers who were trying to take power and making sure that they will remain in charge and changing caliphs, killing caliphs, killing their rivals. Actually, towards the end of the Fatimid dynasty, there was actually a struggle between the ministers and the army leaders. And actually, the last name I would like to mention is the name of Shawar. Shawar was back then was one of the last ministers in the Fatimid state. And this guy was fighting with Dargham. Dargham was the leader, the army leader. And each one of them was trying to take hold of the state. Till Shawar did something which was actually a changing thing that changed the history afterwards. He called for help from Nuruddin Mahmud Zinki, who was the ruler of Aleppo and Mosul. And of course, this very unheard of before, that a Shia minister is calling for help from a Sunni emir, a Sunni prince. And actually, Nuruddin Mahmud did not delay it. He sent one of his very strong leaders to help Shawar take control. And actually, this leader was Asad-ud-Din Shariko, the uncle of Salah ad-Din, who managed actually to become the minister of Al-Khalif Adad, the last of Fatimid caliphs. And then when he died, Salah ad-Din became the minister, and he was loved so much by the Egyptian people. He tried to help as much as he can. The chaos in the state was beyond imagination. Like one of the stories that were told about the interaction between Salah ad-Din, the caliph, and the people of Egypt, who were living in Cairo, is that the caliph liked him so much, and he was actually very supportive of Salah ad-Din, and he gave him a horse, a gift from him. And this horse had ornaments that had some jewelry on. So what Salah ad-Din did, he sold one of the jewels on this horse. And with the money of this jewel, he fed the people of Cairo for a whole month. So imagine the amount of corruption. The minister having a horse that is having ornaments. One of those jewels on this ornament can feed a whole city for a month. This how bad the situation was and how good Salah ad-Din was. He was trying to help. And actually, Salah ad-Din, in the year 1171, under the pressure from Nuruddin Mahmud, he decided to resign the Caliphate al-Adid from power, and they started calling for the Abbasid Caliphate in mosques for prayers. And this was the demarcation for the ending of the Fatimid dynasty and the start of the Ayyubid dynasty. If we look at our timeline again here, we have the Caliphate dynasty starting from 909 up to 1171, and 1171 we have the Ayyubid dynasty starting, and it lasted for almost 90 years from 1171 to 1260, but this is another, we're going to learn about them later on. So what about the heritage that Fatimid gave us? So first thing is making Al-Qahira, Cairo. It's a major city, one of the major cities in the world. We know that the word Qahira means the conqueror. So they built a very strong city. It was built on 400 acres, had a very huge, large wall that is existent till now, and it has 4 entries: the Nasr, Al-Futuh, Zuwaila, and Al-Mutawalli. And up until now, it's, of course, you all know that it's the current capital of Egypt, and most of the Fatimid architecture within the city is still existent. So personally, when I'm from Egypt, I used to live in Cairo, and when I was in high school, early college, this was my favorite thing to do, is just go to Fatimid Cairo and just tour the place and hang out there. It's beautiful architecture, beautiful layout, actually one of the most important things that anyone can do if visiting Cairo. The second thing they did is they building the Azhar Mosque. And initially, it was not intended to be simply a mosque. It was intended to be a university. So they have their teachers, they have libraries, they were having like actual school classes in this mosque, in addition to paying prayers as well. And of course, it persisted as a Shia school up until the Sunnis, the Ayyubids, took power and they changed the function of the Al-Azhar into a Sunni mosque. And actually, it is still one of the functioning mosques as of now. It is actually the second oldest university on earth. The oldest university of earth is Al-Qayrawan University, or Al-Qayrawan Mosque, that was established in 859 in Tunisia, followed by Al-Azhar. It was established 972, as we said before. And the third was Bologna University in Italy, and the fourth is Oxford University in 1096. So Al-Azhar was established almost 100 years before, more than 100 years before Oxford. Other cultural heritage, the Fatimid well known for the rituals of celebration. They celebrated a lot of events. And Ramadan lantern it's a sign of Ramadan as of now worldwide, is actually one of their heritage. Initially, it had this candle in, and now of course, the modern lanterns have the modern lamps, but the heritage, the concept came from the Fatimids. Ashura feast, the day of Ashura, when we celebrate that Allah has saved Musa sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his followers from Fir'aun. Actually, the Shias started celebrating this day by offering this rice pudding, which still carried tradition that's carried up until now worldwide in the Islamic world. I remember in Istanbul during this time, and I found them serving Ashura plate throughout the city in celebration. Prophet Muhammad's birthday actually was a celebration that was introduced by the Shias in Cairo, and in Cairo we have this sweets, very special sweets for this day. We call it Halwa al-Mulid, and actually it's still existent up until now. Also, when I was reading about the Fatimids, they encourage other celebrations like Christmas celebration, like other even non-Muslim celebrations where Eid al-Ghadir, some other forms of celebrations they endorsed and they encouraged. And they had those Christian and Jews in their state, and they encouraged them to have their own celebrations. And who knows, maybe if we tracked it down, we'll find that the Christmas celebration as we have now has a lot of things to relate to the Fatimids. So final thoughts after we're done, we have to go back again to the ayah, the reason why we're studying history. قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلُ. Oh, who believers, walk on earth and learn what happened to the previous people who preceded you. Do we learn from the Fatimid dynasty? I would like to say that, like any state, the Fatimid had their time where they thrived and prospered, but the main lesson we would learn here is that working hard, even under oppression, will certainly pay off. So they had 2 years of 2 centuries, to work under extreme oppression, but they managed to prevail afterwards. This is a very good, important lesson for us. Other lesson that we have to learn is that minor deviations in the beginnings can lead to major changes to the ends. We know that a simple deviation that started after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when some of the Muslims believe that Ali is most worthy of following the Prophet than the regular Khalifas that we believe in. This was initially like a small thing, but as time came by and centuries followed, the deviation became so huge to the point that we are now having this major division in the Islamic world between Sunnis and Shias. Shias history is an important part of Islamic history. The Ismaili Shias who managed to do the Fatimid dynasty, managed to establish it, existed for a long time, and as of now when we're talking, they're still existent, the Ismailis. They actually have a mosque very close to us here, one of the biggest mosques, and Houston is one of the main centers for Ismailis in the United States. I have 2 colleagues who work with me who are Ismailis. Cultural impact of Fatimid dynasty on Islamic history is beyond quantifications, in spite of ruling only for little more than 2 centuries. And the reason for this, we can start thinking about the reasons why their cultural impact was so deep, but I believe the most important reason is that they focused on teaching and education. And the first thing they did when they have a major state under the ruling, they built a mosque, which was intended to be a university. I'm talking about Al-Azhar here. So investing in education, investing in teaching people actually pays off and persists even long time, centuries after you disappear from earth. This is one thing that we learn also from the Fatimid.